The first thing Ruth Calloway noticed about Silas Drummond was not his face. It was the gate. Wrought iron, standing 10 feet tall at the mouth of the property road, and behind it, fenced pastures so green they looked painted onto the valley floor. The second thing she noticed was his hands. He stood at the gate with one palm resting on the top rail, and his fingers were thick and scarred and steady the way the hands of a working man get when they have built something worth keeping. The knuckles were wide and the nails were trimmed clean. Then he turned, and she understood what the women in town had meant. A deep scar pulled the left side of his mouth into a permanent half-frown. His nose had been broken at least twice and had healed crooked both times. His jaw was too wide, and his brow too heavy, and one ear sat slightly lower than the other, as though God had assembled him in poor light and never gone back to check the work. There was a second scar, thinner, running from his left temple into his hairline, half hidden by the brim of his hat. Ruth did not flinch. She had answered the advertisement knowing exactly what the terms were. A widower with one child needed a wife who could cook, keep house, and manage the garden through the growing season. The letter had been honest and clean. 3 pages in a careful hand, every sentence direct, not a wasted word in the lot. It had not mentioned his appearance. She had expected worse. What she had not expected was the ranch. She stood at the gate holding her single carpet bag while the March wind pushed across the valley and bent the new grass flat. Behind Silas Drummond, a white clapboard house sat on a rise with a deep porch that wrapped around 3 sides. The posts were turned, not rough-cut. The barn was freshly painted the color of dark clay. A stone well with a cedar cover stood near the kitchen door, its rope new and its bucket polished. The fences ran straight for what looked like half a mile in every direction, and every post stood plumb. It was the finest piece of land she had ever seen. And she had grown up on land so poor the chickens had to scratch gravel. "You are Ruth." His voice was low and had no question in it. He already knew. She nodded. He picked up her carpetbag without asking whether she could carry it herself, which told her something about the kind of man he was. He did not offer conversation. He did not try to make the moment comfortable. He simply lifted the bag as though it weighed nothing and turned and walked toward the house. Ruth followed. A small face appeared in the window beside the front door. A girl, maybe 6 years old, with dark hair cut bluntly at her jaw and a look on her face that Ruth recognized from her own childhood. Watchful, not afraid, just measuring every detail and storing it away for later consideration. The girl vanished from the window before they reached the porch steps. Silas set the carpetbag inside the door. "Your room is at the end of the hall. The wedding is Saturday at the courthouse. Reverend Payne will be there at 9 in the morning, 3 days from now." He nodded once and walked back outside without another word. Ruth listened to his boots on the porch boards, steady and even, fading toward the barn. She stood in the hallway and let her eyes adjust. The house was clean. Not tidy the way a man tidies when company is expected, shoving things into drawers and wiping only the surfaces that show. This was genuinely clean. The floors had been swept and oiled. The windows had curtains, plain cotton, hemmed evenly with small precise stitches. A cast-iron stove sat in the kitchen with a pot of beans already simmering, and the smell of them filled the whole back of the house. Someone had set 2 places at the table. 2, not 3. She found her room, a narrow bed with a quilt folded at the foot, a washstand with a white basin and a square of soap wrapped in cloth, and a small mirror on the wall. The quilt was old but carefully mended, every patch aligned, every stitch tight. She pressed her hand against it and felt the tiny work of it and knew a woman had made this, years ago, with patience and with love for the person who would sleep beneath it. That told her more about the dead wife than any conversation could have. That first night, Ruth cooked supper from what she found in the pantry. Salt pork, dried corn, biscuits from flour that was still fresh. The pantry itself surprised her. It was deep and well ordered, with jars of preserves on the top shelf and sacks of cornmeal and sugar lined up on the bottom. A man who kept a pantry like this was a man who planned ahead. She set 3 places at the table. Silas came in from the barn and stopped in the doorway when he saw the 3rd plate. Something crossed his face. Not quite surprise, something more private than that. "She does not eat much." His voice held something careful in it, something he was trying to keep level. She's been particular since her mother passed. Ruth did not ask how long ago that was. She could read it in the house, long enough that the curtains had faded unevenly where the sun hit them. Recent enough that the quilt was still on the guest bed, as though someone might come back for it. The girl came to the table without being called. She climbed into her chair and sat with her hands in her lap, and studied Ruth the way a barn cat studies a new dog. No hostility, just the close, patient attention of a creature deciding whether the new presence was safe. "My name is Ruth. What is yours?" The girl looked at her father. He gave a nod so small it barely moved his chin. "Nettie. That is a fine name." Nettie offered nothing else. She ate half a biscuit and 3 bites of corn, and then climbed down from her chair and disappeared into the back of the house without a sound. Her feet made almost no noise on the floorboards, as though she had learned to move through this house like weather. Silas watched her go. Then he looked at Ruth across the table. She has not spoken that much to a stranger in 4 months. Ruth cleared the plates and kept quiet because there was nothing she could say that would not sound like a promise she had no right to make yet. They married on Saturday. The courthouse was cold and smelled of pine oil. Reverend Payne read the words too quickly, as though he had somewhere else to be. 2 witnesses sat in the back row, an older couple Ruth had never met, and the woman kept glancing at Silas with an expression she probably thought was sympathetic, but was really just curiosity wearing a polite coat. Silas wore a clean shirt buttoned to the collar and stood very still with his scarred hands at his sides. He spoke the vow without looking at Ruth. She spoke hers while looking directly at him, because she had decided that if she was going to do this, she would do it with her eyes open. His face did not change when she held his gaze, but he did not look away either. Afterward, they walked back to the wagon in the cold morning air. Nettie sat in the bed of it, wrapped in a wool blanket with her knees drawn up and her dark hair blowing across her face. When Ruth climbed up beside Silas on the seat, Nettie did not look at her. But on the ride home, as the wagon rattled over the frozen ruts, Ruth felt the girl lean forward and rest her forehead very briefly against her shoulder blade. It lasted no more than 2 seconds. A breath of warmth through the fabric of her coat. Then Nettie pulled away and stared at the passing fence posts as though it had not happened. Ruth kept her breathing steady and did not turn around. Some things, she understood, needed to be received without acknowledgement. The way rain falls on ground that has been dry a long time. You do not comment on it, you simply let it soak in. The days found their shape. Ruth cooked breakfast before dawn while Silas fed the stock. She swept the house, beat the rugs, scrubbed the stove until the iron gleamed, weeded the garden that had been neglected since autumn and was half buried under dead stalks and wild grass. She hung the laundry on the line behind the house and felt the March wind try to take the sheets right off the pins. She discovered that the ranch ran 40 head of cattle and 12 horses, and that Silas did all the work himself with one hired hand named Eldon, who came 3 days a week and smelled of chewing tobacco and did not talk much either. She discovered that the root cellar was well stocked with potatoes and onions and jars of pickled beets, that the spring house kept butter cold even in April, that every tool in the barn hung on a labeled peg, each peg carved from the same wood, each label written in the same careful hand that had written the advertisement she answered. She discovered that Silas Drummond had built all of this with his own scarred hands, every fence, every shelf, every peg. And she noticed when she went to town that the people there could not stop talking about his face. She went to the general store for flour and lard on the second Wednesday after her arrival. The clerk, a woman named Mrs. Lyle with sharp eyes and a mouth that never fully closed, looked at her with something halfway between pity and fascination. "So you are the one who answered the advertisement." Ruth set her coins on the counter. "I am." Mrs. Lyle leaned closer, dropping her voice to that register women use when they want everyone in the store to hear them pretending to whisper. "They say he was kicked by a horse when he was 12, and then, again, at 19. Some say it was a mule. Either way, bless your heart." Ruth picked up her flour and tucked the sack under her arm. "My heart does not need blessing, Mrs. Lyle, but I thank you for the thought." She walked out with her back straight and her jaw set. The town would think what it wanted. She had married a man whose gate swung true on its hinges, whose child had clean fingernails, whose pantry was never empty, and whose floors were swept before she ever arrived to sweep them. She had married worse in her mind many times before she married better in her life. By the third week, Nettie began to follow her. Not closely, not with any admission of intention. The girl would simply appear at the edge of whatever room Ruth was working in, silent as a shadow and twice as patient. If Ruth was hanging laundry, Nettie would sit on the porch step and fold a dishcloth over and over in her lap, creasing it smaller and smaller until it was a tight square in her hands. If Ruth was kneading bread, Nettie would stand at the far end of the kitchen table and watch her hands move through the dough with the focus of someone studying a craft she intended to learn. Ruth never called attention to it. She'd been a watchful child once, trailing her own mother through a kitchen not half as fine as this one, and she knew the fastest way to drive a cautious creature away was to reach for it. So she let the girl orbit at whatever distance felt safe, and she worked steadily, and she waited. One afternoon she was mending a fence on the kitchen garden, bending wire with pliers, and Nettie appeared with a pair of 2 large leather gloves. "These are for your hands." Nettie set the gloves on the gatepost and walked away before Ruth could draw breath to thank her. Ruth pulled on the gloves. They were enormous on her, swallowing her fingers past the first knuckle. They belonged to Silas. They smelled of saddle leather and hay and the faint mineral scent of the iron tools he handled every day. She wore them for the rest of the afternoon, and when she came inside for supper, she set them on the table beside his plate without a word. Silas looked at the gloves, then at Nettie, who was eating her beans with her eyes on her plate, then at Ruth. Something moved behind his eyes, but he only picked up his fork and began to eat. That night, after Nettie was asleep, Ruth sat on the porch in the dark and listened to the coyotes call across the valley, their voices thin and high, carrying for miles in the still air. Silas came out and stood at the far end of the railing with his arms folded against the cold. "She brought you my gloves." She did. A long silence. The wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek and made a sound like many small hands turning pages. Her mother used to wear them in the garden, too. Ruth felt the weight of that sentence settle over the porch like a second darkness, and she held still under it. The ranch needed mending in places that Silas had not let anyone see, not the public face of it, which was straight and painted and proud, but the hidden seams. The south fence had 3 posts rotting at the base where the ground stayed wet after snowmelt. The chicken coop roof leaked in 2 places, leaving puddles on the straw that the hens avoided by crowding into one dry corner. The windowsill in the parlor had gone soft with damp and would need replacing before winter came again. These were not failures of laziness or carelessness. They were the failures of a man trying to do everything alone and running out of daylight, a man who had no one to hold the other end of a board, no one to say, "This one needs doing first." Ruth did not ask permission. She pulled the rotten fence posts herself on a Tuesday morning, dug the holes deeper, set new cedar posts, and tamped the earth around them hard with the flat end of a maul. Her shoulders burned and her palms blistered inside the 2 large gloves, but every post went in straight. When Silas rode in that afternoon from moving the herd to the upper pasture, he stopped his horse at the fence line and sat in the saddle looking at the new posts for a long time. The horse shifted beneath him, and he did not notice. "You did this. It needed doing." He dismounted and walked the entire length of the repaired section, pressing each post with both hands, leaning his weight into them. Not one of them moved. He came back to where Ruth stood with dirt on her apron and sweat drying on her neck, and he looked at her with an expression she could not quite name. "You set them deeper than I would have." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Ground is softer after the rain. Seemed right to go deep while I could." He nodded slowly. Then he looked at the posts one more time, and something in his posture changed. Some tension she had not realized he was carrying in his shoulders eased just slightly, as though a rope had been let out by one notch. He led his horse to the barn without another word. Ruth stood in the late afternoon light with the valley spread out around her, and she realized that was the closest thing to admiration she had heard from him, and that it mattered more to her than she had expected. By May, Nettie had begun sitting beside Ruth at supper instead of across the table. She had begun bringing her primer to the kitchen in the mornings and reading aloud while Ruth cooked. Her voice was small and careful, shaped around each syllable with the deliberate effort of a child who takes words seriously. She stumbled over the longer ones and stopped and looked at Ruth. Ruth would say the word once, gently, without making a lesson of it. Nettie would repeat it and move on. Silas watched this from the doorway one morning with his hat in his hands, holding it by the brim the way a man holds something when his hands need to be doing something, but there is nothing left to do. Ruth saw him, but pretended she did not. The trouble came in June, riding up the property road on a bay horse. A man named Harlan Cates dismounted at the front gate on a Tuesday morning with a deed claim and a lawyer from the county seat. Cates was a large man with a clean hat and new boots and a voice that carried across open ground the way a church bell carries. He had the kind of face that had never been hit by anything. He told Silas the eastern 40 acres had been surveyed wrong and that the true boundary put the best grazing land on the wrong side of the line. Silas stood on the porch and listened with his arms at his sides and his face perfectly still. Ruth watched from the kitchen window. She saw the way his hands opened and closed once, slowly. She knew he was afraid, not of Cates, not of the lawyer, of losing the land his father had cleared and his grandfather had walked before that, the land he had built his whole life upon. Cates looked at Silas the way people always looked at Silas, with a flicker of something in his eyes that he believed he was hiding but was not. A small, unconscious flinch, a moment of looking away and then looking back with too much control. "I will give you a fair price for the parcel, Drummond. Save us both the court fees." Silas gave no answer. Cates waited, growing impatient in the silence, and then shook his head and rode off with his lawyer trailing behind. That night Silas sat at the kitchen table with the original deed spread in front of him. His hands were flat on the paper, as though he could hold the land in place by pressing hard enough. The lamp cast his shadow large against the kitchen wall. Ruth sat across from him and folded her hands on the table. "The survey markers. Do you know where they are?" He looked up. His eyes were tired. "Stone cairns. My father set them in 1861. Then they are still there." He stared at her. "You think that matters against a lawyer from the county seat?" Ruth kept her voice level. "I think a stone cairn set 65 years ago by the man who cleared this land matters more than a paper filed last week by a man who has never held a post-hole digger in his life." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile. Silas Drummond did not smile easily, and the scar made every expression cost him more than it would cost another man. But something close to it, something that loosened the permanent frown and let the rest of his face speak. They rode out the next morning, the three of them. Nettie sat in front of Ruth on the mare, her small hands wrapped in the mane, and she leaned back against Ruth with the complete trust of a child who has stopped deciding whether to trust and simply does. They found the cairns exactly where the father of Silas had placed them. 4 stacks of river stone, each one waist high, each one marking a corner of the original claim. Undisturbed, unmoved, the survey of Cates was off by 200 yards. Silas stood beside the easternmost cairn, with his hand on the top stone, and did not speak for a long time. The wind moved across the open pasture and pressed the grass flat around his boots. Ruth waited. Nettie leaned against the leg of Ruth and watched her father. When Silas finally turned, his eyes were wet. "You knew they would be here. I knew your father built this ranch to last. A man like that does not set his markers careless." He looked away toward the ridge and blinked twice, and then his face was steady again. But his hand, when he reached down to lift Nettie back onto the horse, was trembling. And he did not try to hide it. The lawyer from the county seat came back the following week with a revised survey that confirmed the original boundaries. Cates did not return. The eastern 40 acres stayed exactly where they had always been, exactly where a careful man had staked them 65 years before. But something else had shifted, something in the house itself. Silas began speaking to Ruth in the evenings, not long conversations, not confessions, a sentence here, an observation there, careful offerings laid down like cards turned face up one at a time. He told her that the paint on the barn was a color his wife had chosen from a catalog the year before she died. Burnt sienna, the catalog had called it, and she had laughed at the fancy name for what was really just the color of good dirt. He told her the cottonwood trees along the creek had been planted by his grandmother the year she arrived from Missouri with nothing but a trunk of clothes and a pouch of seeds. He told her Nettie had been born during a blizzard and that he had delivered her himself because the doctor could not get through the snow, and that the girl had come into the world silent, and he had been terrified until she opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression so calm he almost apologized to her for worrying. He told her these things the way a man opens a gate 1 inch at a time, checking after each inch to see if the thing on the other side is going to bolt. Ruth did not bolt. She listened and she nodded, and she handed him coffee, and she let the silence fill the spaces where words were not yet ready to go. One evening in late June, Nettie came to the supper table carrying something in both hands, held flat in front of her with the seriousness of a child presenting something she considers important. It was a drawing, done in charcoal on the back of a page torn from her primer. 3 figures standing in front of a house, a tall man with broad shoulders, a woman with her hair pinned up and an apron tied at her waist, a small girl between them, holding both their hands. Nettie set the drawing on the table beside the plate of Ruth and climbed into her chair and began eating her beans as though nothing remarkable had happened. Ruth looked at the drawing. The woman in the picture was smiling. The girl between the 2 figures was smiling too. The man was not smiling, but his hand, drawn with the careful attention of a child who had studied the hands of her father her whole life, was wrapped firmly around the fingers of the little girl on one side and the fingers of the woman on the other. At the bottom of the page, in careful printing, were 3 words. "This is us." Ruth could not breathe for a moment. She set her fork down very quietly and pressed her fingers against the edge of the table to keep them from shaking. Silas picked up the drawing. He looked at it for a long time. His jaw worked once, twice. He set the drawing down and looked at his daughter, and his ruined face held more tenderness than any handsome face Ruth had ever seen in all her years. Nettie looked up from her beans. She looked at her father. Then she looked at Ruth. Her dark eyes were steady and certain and entirely unafraid. "You are staying." It was not a question. The girl spoke with the plain certainty of a child who has made up her mind about the world and expects the world to fall in line. Ruth looked at Silas across the table. He was watching her, and for the first time since she had arrived at his wrought iron gate with her single carpet bag and her quiet nerve, his eyes were not guarded. They were open. They were asking what his mouth would never ask. They were saying what his voice could not yet shape into words. She turned back to Nettie. "I am staying." Nettie nodded once, exactly the way her father nodded, a single firm dip of the chin, and went back to her beans. That night, after Nettie was asleep in her small bed with the quilt pulled to her chin, Silas walked to the end of the porch where Ruth sat in the dark. He did not lean on the railing this time. He stood close to her chair and reached into his vest pocket and brought out a small object and set it on the arm of the chair beside her hand. It was a ring. Thin gold, slightly dented along one edge, polished clean until it caught the moonlight. Something kept in a pocket for years and years, carried close and never offered, because offering it would mean trusting someone with the most private thing he owned. The courthouse ring was for the law. He spoke the words quietly, standing very still in the dark. "This one is for you." Ruth picked up the ring and turned it in her fingers. The gold was warm from being carried against his body all evening. She slid it onto her finger beside the plain band she had worn since Saturday at the courthouse. It fit as though it had been waiting for her hand. Silas stood there a moment longer. Then he reached down and touched the back of her chair, very lightly, the way a man touches a fence post he has just set, to be sure it will hold, the briefest pressure of his fingertips against the wood. And then he went inside. Ruth sat on the porch with both rings on her hand and listened to the wind cross the valley and carry the sound of the creek up to the house. Somewhere down by the cottonwoods, a night bird called twice and then went silent. The stars were thick overhead, and the air smelled of grass and the last of the wood smoke from the stove. In the morning, Nettie came to breakfast, and saw the ring on the finger of Ruth. She looked at her father. She looked at Ruth. Then she sat down in her chair, with the smallest, most satisfied expression a 6-year-old face could hold. The expression of a child who has arranged the world to her liking and finds it exactly right. She ate every bite of her breakfast that morning, every single bite, and when she was done, she carried her plate to the basin herself and set it gently in the water and walked over to Ruth and leaned against her side and stayed there for 3 full seconds before pulling away and going to find her primer. Silas watched from the doorway with his hat in his hands. His face, with its crooked nose and heavy brow and the scar that pulled his mouth down, was perfectly still. But his eyes were not still. His eyes were full in a way that his face would never show and did not need to show, because the people who mattered were already looking. Ruth dried her hands on her apron and looked out the kitchen window at the ranch that spread across the valley in the early light, the white house on its rise, the dark clay barn, the straight fences running to the horizon, the gate standing open at the end of the road because there was no one left it needed to keep out. She had married the ugliest man in the county, and his ranch, every square foot of it, every post and board and pane of glass, was the finest she had ever seen. But the finest thing on the Drummond Ranch was not a thing he had built with lumber or nails. It was the quiet, patient, unmistakable way he had let his daughter show him how to love again. Ruth turned from the window and began to knead the morning bread. The flour rose in a soft cloud beneath her hands. The stove ticked with heat. From the parlor, the voice of Nettie drifted through the house, reading her primer aloud, stumbling over a word and then finding it and moving on. The boots of Silas crossed the porch, steady and unhurried, heading for the barn. Outside, the cottonwoods along the creek moved in the wind like a congregation bowing their heads in gratitude for an ordinary morning. And it was enough.